Hi everyone. In today's class, I'd like to talk to you about pedigrees. Pedigrees are somewhat different from Punnett squares. Um, we use Punnett squares mostly to predict whether or not a particular trait will be passed to the next generation. So if I had black hair and my wife has blonde hair and I want to figure out what the probability is for my children to have either black or blonde hair, I would probably set up a Punnett square. But not everything can be solved using a Punnett square. If I want to just keep track of a trait, okay, I don't necessarily want to know whether or not the next generation will have that trait, but if I just want to keep track of the trait and know where it's from and how it has been passed down, my family or my wife's family, then I would probably use something called a pedigree. Okay. Now, a pedigree, you may have heard the word before. Okay. It was originally used by dog breeders as a means to keep track of male and female dogs within a particular lineage. Mostly because it's quite difficult to create a family tree with just dogs because they have such large litter sizes. But a pedigree, if you're only concerned about tracking a particular trait from one generation to another, and you don't necessarily need to know whether it's a grandparent or uncle or second uncle, etc., right? Then this would be a very useful method. Okay. The pedigree itself is more of a diagram that you can visualize and see what the inheritance patterns might be, as well as who has a trait and who doesn't. Okay. Now, when we get back to the classroom, I'll most likely show you a video about dog breeding and pedigrees. But for now, I'm going to leave that out. We're just going to jump ahead to family trees and pedigrees, and we'll compare the two. I mean, they're quite similar. So a pedigree is like a family tree in the sense that all the different types of relationships that's displayed on a family tree can also be found in a pedigree. So here you have a very simple generic family tree. You can kind of tell that at the top row you have your grandparents, okay, both sets from your mother and father, and then you have your mom and your dad, and then yourself, okay. And if you have siblings, okay, this third row here would have more people or individuals there. So that's kind of why they call it a family tree, because it kind of spreads upwards, okay. And you guys are kind of just rooted down at the bottom. In terms of family trees, though, sometimes it can be very complex. Okay, so for example, if you come from a very simple family, that's like a small family, you would probably just have two sets of grandparents, a mother, a father, and if you're an only child, that would be the family tree. Some of you guys actually have quite a large family, right? You still have two sets of grandparents, but you may have many great uncles and many great aunts, and all of them might have a whole bunch of children as well. So that means you would have a lot of different cousins, okay? Some of you might already be an uncle or an aunt, right? Because you might have nieces or nephews, because you might have siblings that are older than you are. If you kept track of everyone in your family, okay, throughout many generations, both up and down, you're going to have some problems identifying how related you might be to these people. Certainly in the English kind of setup, okay, the way that you would say, oh, this is your first cousin, second cousin, third cousin, great uncle, great aunt, second cousin once removed, etc. Okay. If that kind of stuff is confusing, don't worry, because it's confusing for most people. I'll provide a link to how this all works. Okay, it's not like you need to know how this works, but this one's mostly just out of interest. When you look at an actual pedigree, though, it's actually not as confusing. Okay. The main thing again, and I'm just reiterating, a pedigree is used to follow a genetic trait. Okay. A family tree does not have to follow a trait at all. Most family trees don't even mention any genetics. They just want to know relationships. But if we want to be able to identify those relationships as well as its genetic trait, a pedigree is the way to go. So a pedigree might look something like this. So you'll see a series of rows with a bunch of circles and squares. Okay. Some of those circles and squares are colored or filled in. Some of them are left blank. There are often numbers on the side in Roman numerals, and there's often numbers underneath each circle and square. All of these have meaning. All of these symbols represent something. And it's my job for this video lesson to just give you the basics of how a pedigree is set up. Okay. So here we have a very small pedigree. Okay. I'd like you to pause the video here and take the time to just sketch out this particular pedigree. We're going to be sketching it out at least twice. Okay. Once you have sketched it out, okay, we'll go over what each of the individual symbols and lines actually mean. Okay. So to start, a square basically represents a male. Okay. So every square that you see is a male individual. So that means the circles must be females. Now, right now it doesn't matter if the shape is filled in or not. Okay. As long as it's a square, it's a male. As long as it's a circle, it's a female. Now, the ones that are filled in, these are the ones that we are interested in. Okay. The shaded shapes are basically there to symbolize people that are carrying the gene that we want to study. So if I wanted to look at people with brown eye color, right? If that's my goal, every shaded individual represents someone who would have brown eye color. The ones that are not shaded simply do not have brown eye color. Okay. So they literally could be representative of any type of trait that we want. If it's a disorder, then those three individuals on the pedigree that are shaded in would have the genes for a particular disorder. And the ones that do not, they don't have the disorder. Okay. So it is as simple as that to begin with. They can get a little bit more complex, and there's often, and because families are very complicated too, like relationships and marriages and things like that, there's always new genes that are being, thrown into a family. But if we're only focusing on one trait, okay, sometimes even that can be quite complex. So we normally only look at one trait at a time. So if I wanted to look at something like brown eye color and a genetic disorder, I would likely to have two separate pedigrees for that instead of putting them all into one. Now let's look at the lines. The horizontal lines, and I'm talking about these ones over here between the shapes, okay? Not the little lines down here that just represents a blank. But if we're looking at a line between two shapes, that is called a marriage line. Okay, so traditionally it's called a marriage line. Modern times we just call it a mating line, okay, because you don't necessarily need to be married in order to have offspring. So you can call it a marriage line or a mating line. It's just that it represents that two individuals have made some kind of union to form an offspring. Okay, so this male that we have here and the female over here, since they're connected by this horizontal line, these two are considered to be partners. The vertical lines represents a child line. Okay, so you'll see noticeably that there is a vertical line that stems from the marriage line. Okay, now that vertical line does branch off into three separate vertical lines. Okay, so these three separate vertical lines that my mouse is highlighting or pointing to, those are all considered to be the child line. So on this pedigree, there are 4 child lines. There's one here, there's one here, one here, and then there's one over here. Okay, so this last child line, because this person is an only child, it has a direct line to the marriage line. Okay, so that means we can also look at relationships between the shapes. Because this child line branches off into 3 individuals, these 3 individuals here, the female, the male, and the other male, they're all siblings. Okay, they're all related to each other. Now, I'm just going to move myself over to the other side a bit. Okay. The next thing I want to point out is often on the left-hand side, you'll see Roman numerals. Okay. So there's Roman numeral 1, 2, and 3. These Roman numerals basically represent the generations. So you have the first generation, okay, with your male and female, the second generation with these 4 individuals, and then the third generation with just 1 individual. So every row is a new generation, and we do our best to try and keep people who are in the same generation in the same row. Okay. Now again, sometimes with larger families, that's going to be hard to do, especially if there's a lot of marriage lines in between. But I'll kind of get to how to draw out a pedigree a little bit later. So every pedigree does follow some kind of inheritance pattern. You'll hear me use this word inheritance pattern quite often. All it really means is what type of inheritance are they acquiring? Okay? Is it a dominant type of inheritance where you're looking or following a dominant gene, mostly autosomal in nature, or are you following a recessive autosomal gene? Okay. Now, because you have an idea of what dominant and recessive autosomal are, okay, from an earlier lesson, there are 2 other types of inheritance patterns that involves the sex chromosomes specifically. I won't get to that in this lesson, okay, but a few lessons from now, you'll hear me say something like sex-linked inheritance patterns. Okay. They can also be dominant and recessive as well. So when we get to them, I'll kind of go into more detail about them. Okay. The main thing that you have to ask yourself whenever you're looking at a pedigree is, are we following a dominant trait or are we following a recessive trait? A pedigree should be able to visually show either one of them. Okay, and if we recognize the pattern, we can figure out what those traits might actually be. Okay. So in the next couple of slides, I'll show you how to figure out what the inheritance patterns are, just like some of the basic ones, as well as whether or not individuals are dominant and recessive. Okay, because that's something that you can also easily figure out too, just by looking at a pedigree. All right, so on the existing pedigree that we have, Now it's up to you whether you want to redraw that pedigree again, because we're going to be writing over this particular pedigree on the left here. And if we're writing over it, it might not be as clear or crisp as the original. Okay, that's all I'm really saying right for now. So in order to figure out whether we have dominant or recessive patterns, we have to make a couple assumptions. Okay, so first of all, you were only given the image of this pedigree. You weren't told whether or not you're following a dominant or recessive. Okay, so someone else is like saying to you, okay, well, I see this pedigree that we have here, but are we following a dominant trait or a recessive trait? Okay, so the first thing you have to do, you have to make an assumption. Okay, so pick one of the two. I'm going to select dominant. Okay, I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, okay, you know what, maybe it's a dominant trait. So if it were a dominant trait, that means every shaded individual has at least one dominant gene. Okay, so here it says you can have either homozygous dominant, heterozygous dominant, or sometimes if we're uncertain, okay, we leave a blank for the second one, right? So in this case here, let's put a blank. That blank could be for a big A or a small a. It wouldn't matter just yet because the phenotype would still be the same. It would still be dominant. Okay. So if the shaded individuals are dominant, that means all of the unshaded individuals must be recessive. Okay. So this has to be recessive, and this one here has to be recessive. So the important thing is once you filled out the genotypes, you gotta look at it and see if it makes any sense. Okay, so I want you to try that right now. Look at the genotypes that we have, see if anything doesn't make sense. Okay, so something odd should strike you. Okay, so let's look at the parents. The parents are like, at least this parent for sure we know is recessive, okay, because that's all they could be, okay, under this assumption. Now this parent here has one dominant gene, so it's been shaded in, but you have to look at the children. Can these two parents create these three offspring? Well, you have a couple of recessives. Okay? There are two recessive boys and one dominant female. The female, the mom, is also dominant. Okay? But in order for the sons to be dominant, this has to be a recessive. Okay? The second allele for the female must be recessive. Otherwise, you can't get the recessive son. Right? Remember, each parent gives only one of their two alleles. So the male has no choice but to give a small a. The female can only give a small a in order to have recessive males. If the female was homozygous dominant, it wouldn't work. Okay? So this side of the family checks out. So now you look at the second family here. Okay? These two individuals are shown as recessive. But look at the child. The child is dominant. How could that be possible? None of the parents actually have a dominant gene. Okay? So if the parents didn't have a dominant gene and the child has a dominant gene, there must be a mistake somewhere. Okay? This is probably not the right assumption. Okay, so our original assumption that we were following a dominant gene is false. So let's try it again. Okay, so again, if you need to draw out the pedigree again, please do so. After you're done, you can just unpause it and carry on with the lesson. So this time around, we are going to assume that it's a recessive trait. Okay? Because we already know the dominant one didn't fit in. So if it's recessive, all the shaded individuals, okay, would be recessive. Like that. Okay. What I want you to do, I want you to try and figure out the genotypes of the unshaded individuals. Now, because we're following a recessive, all of the unshaded ones phenotypically are dominant. So what that means is that there should be at least one dominant gene or allele in their genotype. And that's pretty much a good place to start. Okay. If we have at least one dominant allele for each of the non-shaded individuals, okay, now we just go back and we try to figure out if it's possible to see what that second gene might be for each of those individuals. And again, you look at it family by family. So if I start with the first generation, you have a dominant individual mirroring a recessive individual. The children kind of tells me that because I have a recessive male, a recessive female, the male must be heterozygous. So I put in a small a there. Okay. Now the other ones, the other two males that are left over, they both display a dominant phenotype, but according to us at the beginning, we weren't sure what their second allele is. But since we know the mom is recessive, and again the mom can only give a small a, each of these has to be the recessive allele. So we double check to see if everything looks good. Okay. Parents work out, the kids work out again, right? It's the same as the other scenario. This family seems to work out just as well if we were following a recessive. So let's look at that last. Let's look at that last family. Okay, the one that didn't work out under the dominant trait assumption. So here we have two dominant individuals. One of them has been now identified as heterozygous dominant. The other one, okay, is still big A blank. But if we look at the child now, we can tell that one of these recessive alleles comes from the dad. The other one has to come from mom. So mom must also be heterozygous. And if mom is heterozygous and dad is heterozygous, it is possible for them to have a recessive child. So this one here works out. The previous one was impossible to have. Okay, given what the parents' genotypes were, it was impossible to have that child. But here, it's absolutely plausible. So if everything works out nicely, then we probably assume correctly now that we are following a recessive trait. Okay. So this is what I mean about inheritance patterns. The dominant traits show a specific pattern from generation to generation, and the recessive traits show a different pattern from generation to generation. And sometimes we have to kind of figure this out in a pedigree, okay, before we actually can use or do anything useful with it, right? So even though pedigrees can be pretty complex, we've only looked at just two symbols. Okay, we've looked at the male and female, and then we looked at a couple of different types of lines. But there are other types of symbols that I haven't shown you yet. So here's a list of the ones that you will eventually know more of. If a person is deceased, okay, meaning that they've passed away, they've died, they're no longer alive, we use a diagonal line. Okay, so it's not the shape that matters. Okay, it's the diagonal line that crosses through it. So when it's striked out like this, we're saying what this means is there's a male that has died. Okay, if it were female, it would be a circle with a cross through it. Now, if you're adopted, okay, the symbol that we use are two brackets. So if we put two brackets around a shape, whether it's male or female, that means that that person is adopted. So here we have an adopted male. The carriers. We've talked about carriers before. They are people that carry one of the recessive genes and one of the normal dominant genes. Okay, so carriers are never affected by the disorder, and they're normally the homozygous. But here, we give them a unique symbol. Okay, they're half shaded. Now it makes sense because when you half shade it, it just means that it has two different alleles. Okay, but I want you to use carriers only when we're talking about a genetic disorder. Okay, I don't necessarily want you to use the symbol for carriers if we're just wanting to show that someone is heterozygous. Okay, so if I had brown eyes, heterozygous for brown eyes, I wouldn't use a carrier to tell people that I'm heterozygous. Okay, brown eyes is not a disease, so for our purposes, we'll use the carrier symbol only if we're talking about some kind of genetic disorder. Twins are also a big issue. Okay, twins are common. You might know of a set of twins. So on a pedigree, they also have to be represented as well. So this symbol here, you have two siblings. Okay, they branch off from the same family, okay, from the same marriage line, but because they're identical, there's a line that comes between them, like this. So it almost makes like a triangle. The other types of twins that we have are non-identical twins, or fraternal twins. Okay, so in this case here, if both the symbols are the same, okay, the shape, that means that they're just boys. Okay, they're boys that are twins. They come from the same parents, but they're not identical to each other. Over here, again, they're not identical to each other, but they're from the same parents. They're born at the same time. Okay, so that's why their child line is kind of joined together. But you can clearly tell that these two are not identical because one's a male, one's a female. So when you have non-identical twins, there's no lines connecting between the shapes. Okay, and if you are an identical twin, then you do have a line connecting in between. Now, I will give you a handout that looks like this. Okay, it has a whole bunch of different symbols that you may or may not need for your particular family pedigree. But there's a couple that I could point out right now. Okay, most families, they might have gone through some kind of divorce. So most of the time you can show that by breaking the marriage line to show that there's the divorce. There's one over here, okay, called unspecified gender. This just means that we're not sure what the gender actually is. Okay, you might know that a couple is pregnant and they're expecting a child, but you don't know what that child's gender is at the time. So if that's the case, we kind of just use a diamond shape. There's a whole bunch of other ones on both diagrams here that I will most likely talk through it with you when you guys are in class. But this is what I'm saying. Some people have some very simple, straightforward pedigrees, and others, just because their family's complex, they will have a very complex pedigree. It's just the way it is. So when we get back into the classroom, we will go over how to draw a pedigree. What I might actually get you to do beforehand is to draw out your own pedigree for your immediate family. Okay, so just your mom, your dad, and any siblings you might have. If you're an only child, then that will be a very simple pedigree. Okay. I think that's all for now. Like I said, when I see you next, we'll do a lot more pedigree work. See you later. Thank you.